Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aline Shoromoff, and I'm the Senior Vice President of the Community Development and Engagement Function here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And I'm pleased to welcome you all to our virtual convening centered on recent research and a discussion of current policy and practice around pay transparency, which are policies that require employers to include salary information in job postings or at points in the hiring process. Today, our conversation will primarily focus on pay transparency and job postings. We thought it was important to hold this discussion to help illuminate our current understanding of the potential economic implications of these policies and practices, especially for low and middle income job seekers. The Minneapolis Fed doesn't hold a view on the topic, but deepening our research understanding through convenings and dialogues on topics like this is a critical part of our team's mission of advancing the economic well-being of low to moderate income people and communities across the 9th District. And understanding labor market dynamics is also a critical input to the Federal Reserve's mandate of achieving maximum employment. In our time here today, we are excited to bring together a panel of subject matter experts from the academic, business, government, and nonprofit sectors to learn more about pay transparency policies and practices and how they impact workers and employers. Our panelists today are joining us from the Harvard Business School, the Minnesota Business Coalition for Racial Equity, NFP, and the U.S. Department of Labor. We are honored to have their perspectives. So I'm pleased to be kicking off this important conversation. Thank you for joining us. And now I'm happy to introduce Assistant Vice President Wei Nguyen, who will help moderate our panel today.
Thanks, Aline. As Aline mentioned, my name is Wei Nguyen, and I oversee the community engagement and policy development work at the Community Development and Engagement Division at the Minneapolis Fed. I'm so pleased to be here this afternoon to moderate this important conversation about pay transparency in job postings. As an issue, our team recently published an article on using data from the job search platform Indeed. You can find the article on our website, and a link is in the chat. In the article, we highlighted what different states have done in passing pay transparency policies. The details of the policies run the gamut, with 7 states mandating the provision of salary information in postings, while 4 states require employers to provide the salary range at some point in the hiring process. We plan to continue doing research on this issue as we think this issue has important economic implications for low-income and moderate-income workers, the group at the center of our work. We are fortunate to have an excellent group of panelists to guide us through the landscape of pay transparency research, policy, and practice. I'll provide a short bio for each panelist and encourage you to go onto our website to read their full impressive bios. Our first panelist is Zoe Cullen. Zoe is an assistant professor of business administration at the Harvard Business School. Next, we have Tiffany Daniels. Tiffany is the managing director of the Minnesota Business Coalition for Racial Equity, a coalition comprised of Minnesota's major businesses and employers. Our third panelist is Catherine Eister. Catherine is the Chief of Staff for the Wage and Hour Division at the U.S. Department of Labor. And last, but certainly not least, we have Megan Nail. Megan is the Vice President of Total Rewards Practice at NFP. In addition to the questions I have for our panelists, we'd like to hear if you have any questions for them as well. If you do, please include them in the Q&A. And with that, let's get into this discussion. So my first question is for Zoe. Zoe, a lot of the research you have done has been related to pay transparency. As we begin our conversation about pay transparency and job postings, can you describe the economic problem that decision makers are trying to solve with these recent policy changes?
Thank you, Hui. Yeah, so I'll begin by just pointing out that the objectives of policymakers might be distinct from what the problem is that economists think the policies are solving. So I will speak from the perspective of someone who's been researching pay transparency as an academic, and I will hopefully touch on what I believe the policy objectives are. So first, I'll just say that I think an assumption behind all of these pay transparency laws is that there is information out there that people don't know. And on top of that, they would value it. So they would actually use it for their decision-making if they were to have access. And typically people think about employees or prospective employees. I'm going to hopefully bring your attention also to firms, which might also have some misinformation about market wages. So there is research that's just asking employees what their perceptions are of pay that they would get at other firms, pay that they would get if they were to try to renegotiate their wages. And indeed, in that context, it is kind of clear that in fact, there's misperceptions about earnings across firms. And on top of that, employees would typically pay quite a bit of money to learn more information, which is usually a sign that there's a role for policymakers to play here in providing valuable information. It's also the case that firms, when asked, will have imperfect information about what their competitors are paying. And there's an open question about how more pay information would also affect their strategy for setting pay. So those are sort of those misperceptions and the expectation that both firms and employees would value this information and indeed pay for it. Those are signs that providing pay transparency could be welfare improving. Now, I'll point out that in some cases, it's clearly not a given. So for example, many pay transparency laws have focused on what I call internal horizontal pay transparency, just revealing the differences between what two workers make. And we've seen in that case that it's true that sort of lower earners will look at that information and try to use it to ask for more. And that's sort of the stated objective of policymakers. And in response to the fact that there's more transparency and more renegotiations, firms have changed their wage setting practices to be more rigid and typically lower. So that's an instance where the particular design of pay transparency, even though desired and solving this problem of misperceptions, didn't necessarily end up improving the position of workers vis-a-vis pay levels. Now, I have reasons to believe that the policy under discussion today, so the posted prices or posted wages that are going alongside job openings, will have pro-competitive effects. And the broad strokes of why that might be the case is, one, there's some evidence to suggest that employees are using that pay information in job advertisements to redirect their job applications to higher paying firms and even potentially higher paying occupations. And on the flip side, we have evidence to suggest that when firms see what their competitors are making, it also intensifies the competitive environment and it puts upward pressure on the wages that they offer. So those two forces suggest that we're talking about a policy with the potential to meet people's demand for information and in a way that ultimately raises wages.
Great, thank you. Tiffany, we're going to move to you. So in your role as the managing director for MBCRE, you work with major companies in Minnesota like Best Buy, Target, General Mills. Why is MBCRE focused and working on pay transparency and job postings?
Thank you for the question, Wei. And before I jump into my response, I have to say I'm so grateful, excuse me, to the Minneapolis Fed for creating this forum and designing this conversation just to bring greater awareness to pay transparency. I feel so honored to be on this esteemed panel with all these experts. And so I am over here feverishly taking notes so I can take some of your thought leadership back to the MBCRE membership. So just thank you all again. That is correct, Wei. So I lead the Minnesota Business Coalition for Racial Equity. And you mentioned in my introduction that MBCRE is a consortium of large corporations that are either headquartered here in Minnesota or have large operations here. And our members work together to advance racial equity specifically for Black Minnesotans. And a lot of the work that we do is really about directing resources from the business community to drive more positive economic outcomes for Black Minnesotans. And those resources could be anything. It could be dollars, it could be people, it could be our intellectual capital. It might even be lifting our voice and our influence at the state legislature to advance policies that can drive more equity. As a group of some of Minnesota's largest employers, I mean, our members employ hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans. It's really important that we are maintaining a focus on employment opportunity and specifically how our member organizations are addressing or even disrupting some of their own practices to create greater, more boundary-less opportunity for Black employees to get into their organizations, move through their organizations, or move upward in their organizations, and other underrepresented groups, really as a path towards higher paying jobs, right? Increase household incomes, and ultimately wealth creation. And as we think about that, pay equity and pay transparency play a critical role in this effort. I was reading earlier the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, their 2024 status on Women and Girls Plus report in Minnesota. And the report revealed yet again that Black women earn just 62 cents on the dollar relative to white men. And that amounts to almost $1 million in lost wages over the course of a career, right? That is massive. And in a state like Minnesota, where almost 60% of Black mothers are the breadwinners in their families, we need information about pay on the front end, right? Because it can drive decision making and it can change the trajectory of some of our lives and our families. Businesses really care about pay transparency because there's a connection to a lot of the other things that they care about, right? Employers are talking about belonging and turnover and employee retention, and a lot of organizations thoughtfully measure a lot of these things. And according to Ernst & Young, equitable pay might be one of the fastest routes to addressing inequity that exists in the workplace, right? 40% of folks that responded to their survey about pay equity cited it as the top contributor to a sense of equity and belonging at work. And as we know, equity really begins with transparency and information. I'm also really encouraged, Zoe was lifting up those two forces about kind of the demand for information as well as kind of putting pressure on businesses. And we know that another key business interest is really about improving productivity, performance, and morale for workers because that improves overall business outcomes, right? So that is kind of a long narrative, but I think you start to see really quickly how this topic of pay transparency connects to the topic of equity. It connects to driving positive economic outcomes, and it ultimately connects to us driving and sustaining a really strong economy. And that's why this topic is so important for MBCRE, and I imagine a lot of people that are participating in this webinar today.
Great. Thank you so much, Tiffany, for those insights. Catherine, so you serve as Chief of Staff in the Wage and Hour Division at the U.S. Department of Labor. How does your work at the U.S. Department of Labor connect to pay transparency? Why do you think this has been an issue that has gained traction nationally? And does it connect to any of the other issues that you're working on? I know that's a lot.
It's okay. I got it. Or I'll do my best. I'm echo the gratitude for being invited to speak and to everybody for spending a little time with us in this conversation today. It's already clear why this issue is important and the many different ways it might impact working people. So I wanted to sort of just share, the Department of Labor has an expansive and important mission, but it includes fostering and promoting the welfare of job seekers and wage earners, advancing opportunities for profitable employment, and assuring work-related benefits and rights. And I wanted to lift that up because I think this issue in many ways touches upon many different aspects of people moving into and through the labor market. And, I think across administrations, the Department of Labor has really recognized the importance of a level playing field among employers, right, who are competing for talent and retention, but also, of course, among employers and workers, and making sure, that exactly that idea of the information asymmetry that Zoe sort of grounded us in, that this isn't creating, negative impacts and inefficiencies that don't just harm individual workers, but harm the labor force and economy overall, right? And so in this administration, we've certainly believed that a strong labor force is essential to a strong economy. So, this notion of pay transparency, I think it's critical to talk about it through a gender and racial equity lens, but it really is also just foundationally about balancing information better between the two parties in an employment relationship, right? And creating those efficiencies. And, you know, as folks have already named, it can mean that workers are making better decisions about pursuing job opportunities. I'm sure I haven't seen the data, but I'm sure it's true. People are bad at guessing what a particular position may be or the band may be. People can find better job matches. And once they're in a role, right, they can have more confidence in sort of the fairness, the accuracy of the wages that they're ultimately being paid, and, you know, hopefully a foundation of greater sort of trust and transparency to begin with. So I wanted to just name a couple of the relevant federal labor standards. You know, there are federal laws that require workers to have certain information about their rights and protections in the workplace. You know, you see those posters that are up in different work sites, laws protecting workers from different types of retaliation, right? If they're talking about their rights, engaging in protected concerted activities, maybe bringing up issues about potential violations to their employers. And there are also some that actually relate to pay transparency and or paying prevailing wages for specific government programs or government contracts. But, you know, as we know, there's not a national law requiring pay transparency in the hiring process. And so I know we'll be looking at some of the state examples, and your research, of course, does that as well. And the Fair Labor Standards Act, which we administer and enforce, has record-keeping requirements for employers, but it doesn't have requirements around employers providing pay stubs and statements and sort of that transparency once the employment relationship is underway, let alone sort of in the hiring process. So I think it's, you know, just very high level. You know, we've had the experience that when workers have more access to information, you know, it can improve job quality. It can improve their ability to spot problems, raise concerns. It may even improve overall compliance, right, among employers and across different standards, because there's just a greater culture of trust, transparency, information. And I think, you know, from our perspective, and certainly my individual perspective, we're clearly in a moment, right, for conversations around labor and workplace rights, but also, of course, around gender and racial equity, and really what's needed to promote greater trust and balance between employers and workers. And I think this is really in all parties' best interest. And I don't really see this as a priority that's likely to dissipate. I know, you know, anecdotally that this is increasingly important to people I know, and that this has sort of seemed to be a trend that employers are taking up on their own. So I think through the sort of innovation and the evidence that we're starting to gather here, I know we're really, you know, interested to learn what this kind of transparency may do to improve fair pay, potentially reduce wage theft, and just promote economic opportunity. So we're learning as well.
Great. I'm hearing a lot of consistency about transparency and trust amongst employees and employers. So Megan, I see that you've been nodding to some of the answers that the other panelists have given. So in your job as Vice President of NFP, you advise companies on compensation, including companies that are trying to navigate different state pay transparency policies. So how are the businesses you are working with navigating the implementation of the policies in their states, and what are the benefits and costs for some of these businesses?
Yeah, thank you so much, Wei. It's a pleasure to be here. So that's a great question. And I would say it's not really a clear-cut answer. To echo a little bit of what I heard from my other esteemed panelists, many employers that I work with really have locations that cross state lines, or even within state lines, there can be differences with different policies, or they're even in a situation where they may have a large population in one location that does not have transparency requirements or regulations, but perhaps a small population in another location that does have these requirements. So it's really kind of dealing with a patchwork of different things when it comes to pay transparency. But I would say, even given that situation, most employers that I work with realize that pay transparency is more than a trend, and it's not something that's an isolated occurrence. So they're really thinking about how they're going to take steps to work towards more transparency, whether they're required to right now or not. And when I think of kind of an analogy around pay transparency, how I often describe it from a colleague of mine is it's kind of like a snowball rolling down a hill. It's getting faster and faster, it's gaining momentum, and it's just growing bigger and bigger every day. So employers really need to think about and recognize that this isn't only being driven by regulations, but also requirements of the job posting boards, as we've talked about, and candidates who are really expecting to see this information. So even if you're not required to from a regulation or a policy level, it's really becoming a necessity to share this information to recruit talented individuals at all levels within the workforce. And I think this just goes, a continued trend around transparency throughout our society, whether it's to health information, all kinds of different things that are out there that have become more transparent over time. We've talked about some of the benefits already. I think clarity in the recruiting process for both employers and candidates. I've been a long time HR practitioner before moving into this consulting role. And I remember the days not so long ago where there wasn't really a clear range for recruiting, and there would be inefficiencies in the process for both the candidate and the employer if those expectations weren't clear and aligned at the beginning. I also think it's clarity for current employees, particularly if they're applying for a promotion or another role within their organization. Sometimes it's not clear if the pay difference or what that would be between their current role and a new role that they're considering. So it gives them some clarity as well. And then I think the biggest benefit in my mind is increased dialogue around compensation levels and how they're determined. So really requiring employers to think more thoughtfully and strategically about their compensation programs and what those mean and how they explain them. But you also asked about costs, and there are definitely costs as well. Many employers, particularly smaller to mid-sized employers, don't have the access to sophisticated compensation data sets to really help to determine what a market competitive wage is. And even though you can go out and see job postings and with increased transparency, that takes a lot of work to even figure that out. And it may not be truly reflective of what the entire market is. Beyond that, they typically don't have the expertise or the time to analyze data and create a pay range structure. While consultants like myself and my team can do that, it does cost in terms of money and time. In addition to knowing the numbers and thinking about their strategy, there is a huge need for communication and education about compensation throughout the workforce at all levels. We know that not every employer can afford to pay the highest rates. So having an open and an honest dialogue and transparency around this requires skill and knowledge. That's something to be learned. I think one other point is that compensation seems very clear-cut in terms of the ranges and the numbers. It's a pay rate and a pay range, but there are other areas of compensation like bonuses and benefits that can be harder to quantify and really show the value, particularly in a job posting. So those employers that have a total rewards philosophy that prioritizes benefits over compensation can be put at a disadvantage in a job posting that only focuses on a pay range. And even beyond that, to think about those intangible benefits like culture, work-life balance, work environment, those are even harder to quantify and communicate, and those can be overshadowed with more focus on the pay range. So, I mean, at the end of the day, compensation and pay is extremely important. We know unless we're volunteering for an organization, none of us are working for free. However, it's not everything. So we just need to think about how we communicate and really help not only employers, but candidates understand what the total package is so they can make really good decisions for their future.
Thank you so much. Those are some really great considerations that you laid out there too, as for some of the challenges and some of the obstacles. So Zoe, can you talk about some of the economic implications of pay transparency in job postings for low and middle moderate income workers?
Yeah, so going back to the question of what people think pay is before they see any information. We have ways of collecting this type of information, typically through surveys, the best of which incentivize the question. So what do you think you would make if you lost your job today and had to look for another job? And if you guess this correctly within plus or minus 5%, you'll get a bonus. These types of questions have led people to reveal that, especially among the lower earners, that they typically underestimate what the market can support. So if they were to search for another firm tomorrow, they would in fact probably elicit offers that are higher than what they are currently earning. That's really important information because it gives us a sense of what would happen if the truth were out there. And people's beliefs would upwardly revise for those who are at the lower end of the income spectrum. And because of that, we think, and don't know for sure, but think there would be movement towards higher paying firms. And so the simplest answer to this question is our best expectation, our expectation at this time is at least that more applications would go out to higher paying firms. The people who send those applications would be people who are underpaid. And that would lead to more wage compression within a position. So I know that's a simple answer, but actually I think that's a really powerful message.
Great, thank you. So the next question I have is for everyone. So I think, and we've talked about this kind of throughout the conversation, is that workers vary in how much information they have about job opportunities. There are varying degrees of kind of insiders versus outsiders. Does pay transparency matter differently for these two different groups? And relatedly, would it be reasonable to expect that low and moderate income workers might be affected differently because of their status as kind of an insider or an outsider? Catherine, I'm going to start with you.
Sure, it's a really interesting question. And, I think when it comes to, I'm certainly eager to hear what other folks have to say, but when it comes to, if we're thinking about fair pay, for example, pay equity by gender or race, we know that the impact, the dollar amount of unequal pay may be greatest among, more highly compensated workers. You might see those gaps emerge, and numerically, right, they're going to generally be bigger. So that, and I'm sort of correlating maybe insiders with more highly compensated workers in this answer, but that those may be really critical workers to consider when you're trying to close pay gaps, right? And trying to really increase economic equity and opportunity overall. But, from our perspective and at the Wage and Hour Division, for example, we focus our enforcement on the most vulnerable workers who are generally low wage and generally in industries with higher rates of violation, because we know that that's where we're most needed. We know, and so I can extrapolate that that's where this kind of information may be most valuable as well. Because I think, when there's information silos, there's of course, and on top of that, just more uneven power dynamics, and that breaking some of that down can have sort of the immediate market effects that folks are talking about, but can only really have positive ripple effects for these workers and these workplaces in other ways.
Great. Tiffany, how about you?
Yeah, I love that answer, Catherine. And I just want to build and, yes, I'd say unequivocally, it matters, period. Right. And as we're talking about really the power of information and how people want to act on that information, I think having something as clear as a salary range on a job posting, it might mean something very different to different types of workers. But the point is, it's meaningful information, right? You could easily see how one person might use that salary range posting for negotiating power. One person might use it to make a decision about if they even will begin the application process or continue in an interview process because this role may or may not work for their family. And so I think the point is the information is valuable, and those that are impacted will use the information in the way that is most impactful and most resonant to their current situation.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I really like your point that people are going to use it differently, but it's still meaningful for people for what they want to use it for. Megan.
Just to build a little bit on what Tiffany shared, I think another point that makes that information so meaningful, it's when you need it and where you need it. When you're looking at a job and you're reading what those requirements are and making that decision, it's right there. Because you can find some pay information. I always, when people say, where can you find reputable pay information that I don't have to, I don't have a budget to spend, I always say the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They have wonderful information that is out there and available that you can look at, generally what occupations pay and so forth. But when you've got a pay range, you know what the philosophy is, what the range is for that exact job when you need it. So I think the ease and simplicity of use is really helpful when it comes to all workers, but especially those that may be most vulnerable, to use Catherine's word.
Great points. Thank you. And Zoe.
Well, just to jump on this, it's sort of once you have the information in the job posting, in some sense, the minimum when there's a range is binding. So if you go to your employer with that information, it's not just information you're drawing from another source and arguing for, but it's actually the hard numbers you need to guarantee yourself like a strong negotiating position. And I think that that's useful to people who have, for many reasons, trouble insisting. So, yeah.
Yeah, if I could build on that again, and I mean, we've all looked for jobs at some point, right? And as we have this conversation around pay transparency, it has the power to really open up a different and deeper level of conversation about compensation when you are looking for a job, right? If you see a range, you might then ask, how are you going to determine where an applicant falls in the range when you extend an offer, right? Which again is equipping the applicant or the job seeker with a different level of information and the ability to make a decision about an opportunity or about an employer in a way that may not have been able before.
If I could just quickly build on that, Tiffany, I would take that to the current employees as well, because once you're transparent in your job postings, I believe, and most of the employers I work with, you need to be transparent with your current employees about what their range is. And that same conversation can become a really powerful career development conversation of saying, what do I need to do to move up in this range? Why am I where I'm at? And then what goals do I need to set, or what can we put in place so I can move up higher in that range as well?
I really like that point, Megan. Thank you for making that. All right. So Catherine, recently, we have the link in the chat. The Minneapolis Fed did some research that shows that states that pass pay transparency laws experience the largest increase in job postings with pay ranges, but even states that don't require it, we are still seeing job postings up there. So do you have any thoughts about why that might be, or do you think that there are any other policies out there that might be affecting this?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting finding. I think it builds a little bit on what Megan sort of talked about, that employers are operating across jurisdictions, right, and have experience and exposure. And also, I think that there's clearly some kind of positive feedback loop that, maybe these postings are just getting higher, applications or higher quality, and maybe early evidence that this is affecting some of the inefficiencies and leading to better outcomes for employers as well. But there are a number of, in addition to these state laws, there's some really interesting examples of pay transparency in some federal programs that I think it's worth sort of touching upon, because it does mean that more employers and industries have some experience and awareness. So in the past few years, President Biden has issued 2 executive orders that are aimed at advancing, pay equity, pay transparency, focused on both federal workers themselves and employees of federal contractors, right? So, in terms of federal workers, this is to really ensure that the federal government remains sort of a, model employer and, promote the same outcomes that employers are thinking about as well in general. And then, there was recently a proposed rule from the FAR Council on these exact topics of transparency in postings, and, banning use of salary history and all of that. So this is active rulemaking. There's also, laws that require the payment of prevailing wages, at least as a minimum on government contracts, right? So employers can go above those rates, but there's transparency in that anybody's workers, unions, employers, competitors, right, can all access what that prevailing wage is and work from the same information for the job type and the geography. And even our, migrant and seasonal worker protections, our temporary agricultural protections, even they have really important requirements around disclosing pay rates or providing pay stubs, right, to workers. And so, these laws and practices and regs, they really span a broad range of industries, right? From some very vulnerable lower wage workers to more compensated salaried workers. And so I think that it just means that there's a broader range of employers that are familiar with the practice, maybe ready to put it into practice in different settings where they're not required to. And again, just as a federal employee, it's worth me noting that our largest employer in the country, the federal government, has really robust policies around pay transparency. You can pretty much look up anyone's specific wage, but, pay tables, salary ranges, really clear information about how to get raises and what a promotion might mean for your movement in this table. So there's definitely across the sort of patchwork of examples, a lot of opportunity for information and for both workers to have experience with it and employers to have experience and maybe see some benefits of it as well. So, I think all of this sort of suggests it's following sort of the trajectory of a lot of labor standards and practices and how it's sort of bubbling up in different spaces. And, particularly as we learn more from the state laws and the evidence that they're going to show us, it feels really interesting and likely that we're going to continue to see this sort of become a norm, if not eventually a standard, a legally required standard.
Thank you. Zoe, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that at all?
Well, no, I mean, I'm fascinated by the different directions that the government is going in, and I think that some of these policies we have yet to. In part because it's hard to find a control group. It's been challenging to say exactly what the impact has been of what the federal government has chosen to do with respect to its own employees and then federal contractors. But that said, there's a couple of components I wanted to just highlight. One is the grid, sort of like the full career path, which Megan has brought up as well. And I just want to highlight some research on that, because if there are employers listening, one thing I think that is sort of surprising is that employees not only underestimate what their peers are earning, but they dramatically underestimate what they would get if they were to be promoted in the private sector. And these policies are clearly getting at, addressing this by having the grid and being clear about what a promotion entails. And we've seen in the private sector with experimental evidence that by providing information about the next level up, you see greater motivation and higher productivity from employees. And typically you can even get measures of satisfaction, overall well-being, that are aligned with the sort of higher sales rates and things like that. So I just wanted to highlight that component of what the federal government has been working on.
Great, thank you. Tiffany, do you have any thoughts at all?
Yeah, I mean, just in addition to, what the federal government has done, I think there's also the reality that some employers, they are aware of what's happening in their industry and with competitors. And if you see an employer or a different company or someone in your industry start to move towards pay transparency, and you are fully aware of where you're sourcing talent, then you might start to adopt some of the practices that those other employers have adopted. And then it becomes more of a norm in a particular industry, which then can have an impact on other industries as well. Right. So I think it's, thinking about this as a marketplace where employers are interested in the best people to do the jobs that they offer. Right. And if you are in the business of finding the best people then you want to know the same information that they know, and you want to be able to pay them competitively based on the level and caliber of talent that you want. And pay transparency is a lever for doing that.
Great, thanks. So Megan, I have a question for you before we turn to audience questions.
Oh.
So we've heard of some companies using really broad pay ranges in their postings, some with a gap of like $100,000 or more. So how are the companies you work with kind of thinking about setting salary ranges in their postings?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question because for a lot of employers, especially again in that smaller to mid-size, setting pay ranges in a formal way is a whole new topic for them. Many of them have not been exposed to it before and really have been more informally thinking about pay ranges or what pay rates are based on candidates' expectations and budgetary requirements. This is a whole new level of sophistication. When we think about setting a pay range, it's much more nuanced than just knowing what the market is paying for a role. Some of the other big considerations, which you just brought up, Wei, is how wide should a pay range be? And when we think about it in general, kind of in compensation theory, ranges should be smaller in terms of the gap between the minimum and the maximum rate for more entry-level jobs and larger for leadership positions. And when we think about this, this is because the time it takes for someone to become proficient in a more entry-level role should be much less time. So they should be able to move up much higher in that range much more quickly than in a higher level role. So really, when we think about what a fair range is, it is a little bit subjective to each employer. Some of the employers I work with choose to target higher in the market and pay higher ranges, while others could be due to their philosophy. Maybe they choose to cover much more benefits premiums, or maybe they have budget constraints and they just can't afford to pay as competitively as they would like, maybe paying lower. I think one of the realities that is driving some of these really large pay gaps, like what you described, the $100,000 or more, is that employers don't yet all have the resources to develop ranges that are appropriate for them and unique to their circumstances. And they just have a lack of confidence about what to put out there. A real life issue, another one that I think contributes to this, is sometimes employers do not have clarity on the level of job that they are hiring for, which can lead to this overly broad range being posted. And typically my advice around that is to clarify the job and level that you need, or if you don't know what that is, post 2 or 3 different roles that are at different levels with different, qualifications, levels of experience, different pay ranges that are smaller, but kind of give you that opportunity to look at a variety of candidates. So those are some of the things that I think are driving what we're seeing on some of those large pay gaps.
Thanks, that's so helpful. I hadn't thought of some of those things before. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Great. I am going to ask some audience questions as time permits. Would panelists comment on differentiation in designing job postings as a firm strategy for evading pay transparency efforts? What can policymakers do to support job seekers and lower search costs insofar as understanding how comparable postings are?
So if I'm kind of trying to understand that question, kind of thinking about, it looks like it's a little bit more maybe going to some of what we talked about where employers are maybe struggling, whether that's on design or maybe, not on a purposeful way of knowing kind of what to put out there and really understanding what the right range is and being forthright with a reasonable range of pay. I think if that's kind of where that question is coming from, I can't answer for policymakers, but I think part of it is just making sure to put more education out there on compensation and what appropriate ranges are, and making sure that that data can be easily accessed by employers, so they kind of have the tools to put out a reasonable range of pay that, again, fits what their unique requirements, culture, budget, all of that is.
And I guess to add, we do not administer any of these pay transparency laws specifically that I think is being described in the question. But as a government agency that administers laws, I think that it's worth, talking about, the actual writing of regulations, right, and administering laws, to the extent this is asking about sort of employers evading compliance. I think that has a lot to do, of course, with how different government agencies are setting up the expectations, providing compliance assistance if there is an enforcement or compliance mechanism. But I think as we're all sort of articulating, there's a great potential benefit to the employers as well. So I think that efforts to evade might not bear out in the long run anyway. So I think there's sort of the benefit here of there being a lot of upshot for everybody involved.
Great. So we
I
have
might
a
also-
question. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Zoe.
No, fair enough. I was just going to point out that I do think there's some private companies that have made it easier for people to compare postings. So an example of this is like levels.fyi. What they'll do is make it easy for you to take a unique and so often unusual position title at one company and compare what level that would be at another company. And they're focused, fast growing, but focused on the tech industry for the time being. I could imagine the government taking a larger role in this too, in allowing some standardization for positions that companies can use in order to communicate clearly what the role entails and what the appropriate pay band might be.
All right, another question we have is a lot of the research and commentary on this topic treats transparency as either you are transparent because you posted a salary range or you're not transparent because you didn't post a salary range. In your opinion, what are other considerations for like job posting transparency other than just salary ranges?
I can jump in on that. I mean, I think, again, kind of going back to the idea of that full package of total rewards, like having information out there that not only shares what the pay range is, but what the associated benefits are, what, you know, what candidates can just expect in terms of their work hours and what their work experience is like, and really thinking about being transparent about those other aspects as well, so that people can really assess the full picture. Because if medical benefits are really important to your family and that's what you need, you may be willing to take a lower pay rate by design if there was a very robust benefits package. So I think kind of rounding that out and just the more information that can be provided, not only to candidates, but also to employees on what this current job is and what it involves, but what that future potential is as well.
Great, thanks.
I think there's also a role for being transparent about the process for setting pay. So for example, if a firm were just to be clear, we're going to match outside offers, or we're going to have internal equity, or, you know, just a statement about how pay is going to be set would get them quite far in communicating to the prospective candidate what to expect.
Great. Well, I'm gonna move to our last round of questions. Thank you so much, you guys, for such a great conversation. So I'm going to call this the lightning round. So maybe if everyone will have like 1 minute to answer this last question. Are the state laws requiring posting a range in job postings the right policy lever? Or what alternative policy changes would potentially work better? Tiffany.
I love this question. And I think what we're talking about, you know, pay transparency is one lever. It's not the only lever, right? And as we get more focused on, especially equity across the workforce and the employee experience, there are certainly going to be other pieces of policy that reveal themselves as being important across that life cycle or across that experience, right? I am reminded of the work that our coalition did last year around the Crown Act, right? And the goal of the Crown Act is to ban race-based hair discrimination, and it plays a really big role in creating more inclusive workplaces. It's not that passing the Crown Act means like, hey, we have inclusive workplaces now. It's one piece of policy that contributes to that. And I think we should think about pay transparency as one piece of policy that moves us forward, but there's certainly room for others that we should consider as well.
Great, thank you. Zoe.
Yes, so if I were designing a pay transparency policy, it wouldn't look so different from posted prices and job ads, but it would be distinct in the following way. It would not be information that the firm is providing. It would be information that the government is providing. And it would come regularly to people's either their mailing address or, I don't know, their WhatsApp channel. And they would have like direct information about the distribution of pay, perhaps the distribution of firm average pay in their occupation and industry, and then nearby occupations and industries. So essentially, it wouldn't be, if we come back to this question of what would allow an individual to make informed choices, it would be regular and consistent information about opportunities out there.
Thank you. Catherine.
It's a great question. So I'm not going to speak to, specific legislative solutions, but I think that, that there's clearly a benefit of, clear and fair labor standards. And, I've seen just in my own work, how legislation can address the sort of first mover problem among employers, right? And can propel progress and propel fairer competition. So, that's the benefit in my mind of using public policy instead of putting a burden and responsibility on individual employers, particularly when we're trying to solve for some more systemic issues, not just, an employer or employee preference in a particular industry or market. But yeah, I think Tiffany's points are very important. There are many levers that usually are required to solve sticky problems.
Megan, I'm going to give you the last word.
Oh gosh, now I feel the pressure. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with kind of Tiffany's analogy of there's many tools in the toolbox. And I think sometimes maybe a trap that we need to be aware of is any of us thinking that pay transparency equates to pay equity. I think to Zoe's point, there's lots of different ways to measure that and different tools that we should be putting in to hopefully provide the guidance on what that best practice, what that standard is, and really what those tools are that employers can use. I think employers want to do that. They have a desire to move this way, but the practicality of the steps and the tools that they need to get there can be challenging. So the more tools that we can give them, support and resources will help. And hopefully that creates a culture between giving employees a ton of information, having employers being able to help give them information as well as other sources to create a good culture of trust among everyone.
Great, thank you. Well, I just want to thank all of our panelists for such a great conversation. A lot of things to think about, a lot of new ideas that were shared with the group. So I am going to now hand it over to my colleague, Ryan Nunn, who is going to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Wei. And thanks also to Mary Hogan and Grace Ryan for organizing a really fantastic discussion. And of course, thank you to our panelists for sharing all of your expertise and insights. I want to spend our closing minutes just reflecting a bit on why we're focusing on this topic and what I think we learned from this discussion, just quite briefly. Economists and policymakers are relatively recently beginning to appreciate something that workers have always understood, that the rules of the labor market matter quite a bit for how they can thrive. And here at the Minneapolis Fed, we've studied many of those rules, from the minimum wage to occupational licensing to non-compete contracts. And pay transparency is just the latest in that series of institutions that matter for the labor market and particularly for low-income workers. So today's discussion for me really helped to clarify just why it is that so many states are focused on this issue. For one thing, there's reason to believe that workers are often poorly informed about their job options, as we heard, right at the top of this conversation. There's more to it than that, and I certainly wouldn't say that policymakers have all the evidence needed for fully informed decisions. And adding to that evidence base is our intention in studying pay transparency ourselves. But with that said, what I took from the discussion were a few key points. First, I think it's telling that both workers and employers seem to really care about pay information. Employers routinely pay to learn more about what other firms are paying, and workers adjust their search behavior when they get more information. And on its face, I think this gives us reason to believe that pay transparency is economically important. Second, I heard that employers may have pretty powerful reasons to post more information, even in the absence of policy changes. I think what's interesting to me about that, and perhaps not very well understood, is why employers are increasingly doing this now. An important question for research is just what's driving those recent increases? Is it the tight labor market? How much is spillovers of state level policy changes that happened recently? Is it something about the changing nature of job search? I don't think that's fully understood. And then finally, policymakers and employers are both going to have to think hard about the details of pay transparency. And I heard from this discussion that it's not just about salary. How can benefits, things like the wage setting process itself, the work environment, how can those all be more clearly communicated up front? And with that, I'll just say again, thank you so much to our panel. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you'll continue to look out for our upcoming work on this interesting and important topic.